I'm Sunil Badami and I'm delighted to welcome you to another Roaring Stories online author event here at the wonderful Royal Oak Hotel in Balmain and on Facebook Live. We'll have time for questions later in the session, so if you do have questions or would like to ask Marion a question, you'll have time to do so here in the Royal Oak and on Facebook Live. Just post your questions on the Facebook Live comments underneath the video. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and future and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As I say, I pay my respects to elders past, present and future and to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. Now, please remember to turn your phones to silent. Feel free to take photos, but please make sure you've got your flash off. And feel free to share them on Instagram, Facebook or on Twitter, Roaring Stories or Roaring Stories 268. And remember to hashtag with Roaring Stories and Carbon Club. What do you say about that?
Brilliant.
Well, if there's one hot topic right now, apart from COVID-19, it has to be climate change. From Australia's devastating bushfires last summer to the equally horrific wildfires currently raging in California as we speak, suddenly the issue seems scarily close. It's weird, isn't it? Only a generation ago, the world seemed united in addressing the hole in the ozone layer and rising temperatures. It was a global challenge that seemed to threaten thousands of species, especially us. But only 30 years later, even after more extreme bushfire seasons, droughts and floods, as well as hurricanes, cyclones and other extreme weather events around the globe, it seems we haven't just gone nowhere since then. We've actually gone backwards. How did that happen? And how did the discussion go from a consideration of the facts presented by experts to an emotive argument in which science couldn't be trusted? And the question of how to address this global crisis has become one of whether it even exists at all. The Carbon Club is a gripping, compelling expose of the truth behind how The Carbon Club is a gripping, compelling account or expose of the truth behind how a loose confederation of influential climate science skeptics, politicians and business leaders sought to control Australia's response to the climate crisis. But at what cost to us and to the next generation? And is there any way back from here? Our guest tonight, Marian Wilkinson, is a multi-award-winning journalist with a career that spanned radio, TV and print, and who was inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame in 2018. She's covered politics, national security, refugee issues and climate change. She served as the Fairfax foreign correspondent in Washington, D.C., was the Sydney Morning Herald's deputy editor and senior reporter and executive producer for Four Corners, whereas a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, she reported on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. She won a Walkley Award and the Australian Museum's Eureka Prize for Environmental Journalism for a joint Sydney Morning Herald Four Corners report on the rapid melting of the Arctic sea ice. She's written several books, including The Fixer on former Labor power broker Graham Richardson and Dark Victory on Australia's response to asylum seekers, co-authored with David Marr. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you.
Now, in 1990, we all seemed to be worried about the hole in the ozone layer and global warming. I remember changing from spray-on deodorant to roll-on. But by 2007, and by 2007, both the Coalition and the ALP were offering a carbon price policies going into the federal election. And now, well, what happened? How do we actually go back on addressing climate change?
Well, interestingly, there is a particular moment, I think, when we did start going back, and I detail it in the book, and it's a fascinating story because it was in September 2009, you're right, both parties had gone to the 2007 election promising action on climate change, a price on carbon pollution. And it all changed in September 2009, and there was a very curious event that happened. The big policy Kevin Rudd, as Labor Prime Minister, was trying to get through was the Senate was up for debate. Malcolm Turnbull, as opposition leader, who strongly supported at that stage action on climate change, who was an advocate of the climate science, took off to London. And he went to see David Cameron, a young Conservative leader, who was also wanting to act on climate change. And Turnbull was really impressed with this idea that you could be Conservative and Green at the same time. The slogan was "Vote Blue, Go Green." That was great. What he didn't know was at exactly the same time, his nemesis, in a sense, Senator Cory Bernardi, a very conservative senator from South Australia, was heading to Washington. And he went to see the leading climate skeptics in Washington, was introduced to the senior Republican leadership who were fighting climate change legislation in Washington. And they convinced him that Rudd's legislation could be knocked over, and with it, of course, Malcolm Turnbull's support. And Cory Bernardi came back to Australia, worked with people in the coalition to do precisely that. And I would argue that that was really when bipartisan policy on climate change in Australia died.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian earlier this month talked about, in a forum with Theresa May, the former Conservative Prime Minister of the UK, that it was a dream that the Conservative Party's policies on climate change mitigation and moving to zero net emissions by 2030 were kind of like a dream for her. Why is it that Conservative political parties in the UK and in Germany, where they have closed all the mines without any loss of jobs, why have they taken up, climate change mitigation in a way that Conservative parties in Australia or America or Canada have not?
Well, one of the things I try and dig around in this book is exactly that question, why? And it won't surprise a lot of people out there. It's because we do have a large, powerful and important fossil fuel industry, both in coal and in gas. And I think what we're seeing now is this odd thing, especially since the bushfires, since the Black Summer bushfires, where we're seeing the Liberal Party federally and in the states fracture again over climate change. And I think what will be very interesting for us to watch in the next little while is how the New South Wales government goes compared to what the federal government wants to do, because we all know, we all saw it this week, the big push for the gas-led recovery. The New South Wales government, Gladys Berejiklian's government, has been pushing renewable energy. But the crunch on this is going to come, and it's going to come soon, because the federal government has made it absolutely clear that they want gas expansion in New South Wales and around Australia. And to see a Prime Minister in 2020, just last week, deliver a statement on energy that did not mention the words climate change once, I think tells you what a deep division on this issue we still have.
What is a gas-led recovery? I mean, it was kind of mooted around the time of the Rudd government, at a time when we still hadn't had a big uptake in renewables. But with major falls in fossil fuel prices as a result of COVID, with the oil price going into negative, and also major falls in renewable energy costs, with this increased uptake in technology. Why do we need a gas-led recovery now? And what does it mean for our future energy needs or our transition to net zero emissions, especially if the rest of the world is bypassing gas and going straight to renewables?
Well, I think in some countries, and certainly in Australia, I think what's happening at the moment is the line in the sand, if you like, is being drawn on gas, about whether people will defend gas. In the book, I talk a lot about really the last gasp of a number of politicians, Tony Abbott on the one side, Joel Fitzgibbon on the other, who are defending the coal export industry in Australia. And when I say that, I mean the thermal coal for power stations, not coking coal for steel mills. But Tony Abbott, as you will remember, famously said coal is good for humanity. And when he was Prime Minister, and when this time he worked to bring down Malcolm Turnbull in a couple of amazing moves, which I detail in the book, he was making a last big pitch, a last stand, in a sense, on thermal coal. Scott Morrison has clearly decided that the line in the sand now is on gas. And I think this is going to be very, very problematic for Australia, especially in the climate talks, because there are a lot of people here who see the wonders of gas, that it can, keep fueling Australia, that it can support manufacturing jobs. And when you say, yeah, but what about the emissions? So the answer is, we're only a small proportion of the world's emissions, so we can keep doing this. Basically, we want a bit of a free ride on gas because we've got a lot of it, and we, think we can make a lot of money out of it, and we are making a lot of money out of it.
Yeah, but we're not really making as much money as, say, the world's second largest gas producer, Qatar, who gets $26 billion a year in royalties, and we get $667 million a year by comparison, which is actually $1 million a year less than the government receives in beer tax. So it's really just beer money.
Well, I think there is always the promise there, but when you see the tax structure of these arrangements, you can see that a lot of the costs are, as they say, loaded up front. But I think where the government has been able to really sell this is in regional Australia, where in Queensland, in the Northern Territory, in Western Australia, it's a jobs, jobs, jobs thing. And when COVID happened, well, I think prior to the advent of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of optimism in Australia that we were going to actually move into a clean energy economy. When COVID came along, a path really appeared, I think, and it was a path as the European Union and the United Nations and the International Energy Agency laid out. Would the recovery from the COVID recession lead us to a cleaner economy or not? And in Australia, I think we've said not.
But, I mean, the narrative during the 2019 election, especially in, southwestern Queensland, was that mining provides jobs. But, when we look at countries like Germany, who have closed their coal industries without losing any mining jobs, and we've seen reports such as the recent one by Ernst & Young, which suggests that renewable energy stimulus could provide up to 160,000 jobs, in comparison to, say, Adani, which is only guaranteed maybe 1,500 jobs during construction. So if the government's always talking about jobs, 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 why aren't they interested in this jobs bonanza that can go out into the regions?
I think because in Australia, because of this terribly toxic political debate around climate change, and I talk a lot in the book about how that debate happened and how it was fostered and why it was fostered. But because of that, there is a strong feeling in these regional areas that if you stand against coal and gas, you are standing against jobs. And how that argument is made, like we're seeing it right now in the Hunter Valley. It was no mistake that Scott Morrison went to the Hunter Valley, went to Joel Fitzgibbon's seat to make his announcement, to wedge on Labor. And one of the things that's become really clear in all this is that our politicians have worked out that you can not only wedge your political enemy across the aisle on climate change, but you can wedge your enemies inside your own party on climate change. And I think one of the most depressing interviews I did for the book was with a guy who was Malcolm Turnbull's numbers man at the end when Malcolm Turnbull was being brought down for the final time. And I said to him, you know, how many climate skeptics are there actually in the cabinet and in the joint party room? And he said, oh, probably about a third. And he said, but let me put it this way. I'm saying about a third of people who would say that the climate science is alarmist or it's not real or whatever, the hardline deniers. But there's a whole group that don't care one way or the other. They just see this, in his words, as red meat to throw to the base. And that's what climate change has come down to for those people.
So who is this base? Are they in marginal regional seats? Are they in blue ribbon coalition seats? Where are these people who disagree so heartily with climate change?
They have worked out that you don't need that many of them because they are they're in marginal seats and they're in regional seats. And now it's become, I believe, a bit of a political contest here that's why they try and use it to go for the One Nation voters, to go for the Clive Palmer voters. And I had a long talk with Clive Palmer when I was writing the book about that 2019 election.
You have my condolences.
And I had interviewed Palmer quite a few times before Corners, but one of the interesting things he said when I was asking him about how he played the 2019 election, you know, because he told me he'd spent something like $80 million on it. And I was saying, but, you know, you didn't have that much support and, you know, you weren't really, in the end, you weren't going to win any seats. And he said, yes, I knew that at the end, that I wasn't going to win any seats. But I decided I was not going to have a Labor government. And so that money was all going to go into, he started dovetailing his campaign to go into the Liberal Party strategy and the LNP strategy in Queensland. And he actually said, I decided I didn't want a Labor government. And I said to him, you know, like, why? And he laid out a few reasons. He didn't stress his coal interests in the Galilee Basin, but I'm pretty sure that was up there as well. But at the end of it, he said, yeah, and this was before the electoral returns had come in and people were speculating how much money he'd spent. And he said, oh yeah, it was 83 million, or 80 to 83. And I said, my God, you know, that is a lot of money. And he said, what price democracy? But that is the mentality.
Well, you get what you pay for, don't you? I mean, it seems crazy that a small group of people, whether it's Clive Palmer with 80 million or Gina Rinehart basically funding the entire budget of the IPA.
I'm not sure if it's the entire budget, but it is a hell of a lot. I think they made her the free enterprise, gave her the free enterprise medal for her donations.
I mean, we can see regularly polls come out where 67 to 70% of Australians believe in climate change and we need to do something about it. That the number of solar panel installations domestically is rising and rising, so that effectively there's almost like over 52% of all energy generation domestically is coming from solar panels. So why are the Carbon Club so influential? How have they managed to commandeer the discussion and the narrative?
I think, you know, it's some of the obvious things. They give big donations to both sides, both major parties and the National Party. I think the way the marginal seat game is played is very influential. But on top of that, I think there's something more fundamental, and it's what a very interesting author called Guy Pearce said a while ago when he was writing about this back in John Howard's era, that there's a quarry vision, that the real wealth of this country comes from the mining industry, and particularly the cheap energy supplied by the fossil fuel industry. And a couple of the people I spoke to, I tried to get an interview with Hugh Morgan, who's a central figure in all this, and perhaps not surprisingly, Hugh said he didn't think he'd sit down for an interview with me, and he was keen to write his own book, his own account at one stage. But I did talk to a couple of his friends, and one of the things they said was that he really did see it, and people like him, who they called the Melbourne Club sort of elite, they really did see this as a contest about ideology as well. That they thought people who wanted to do something about climate change were like these European regulators and socialists who wanted to re-regulate the Australian economy and put it at a disadvantage to the major European countries. They didn't want to see the science for what it was. And I also think that's one of the reasons they put so much money or swung so many donations to the science skeptic groups. You know, and one of the skeptics that I sat down with in Washington, he put it very succinctly. He said, we had to contest the science of climate change because if we didn't, the people who wanted to do something about climate change would have the moral imperative on their side, and we couldn't let that happen.
But I mean, why are the views of unqualified experts who aren't climate scientists, like, for example, Ian Plimer, who's a geologist, or Jennifer Marahasi at the IPA, who's a biologist, or Peter Ridd, you know, at James Cook University, who's a physicist, you know, much less, say, Lord Monckton, who has also claimed to have invented cures for MS, HIV, the flu and herpes, right?
The latter I did not know.
Yeah. So why are these non-experts given such prominence? And what's behind the suspicion of experts, you know, not just in regards to climate change, but COVID?
Well, I think that, again, it is a curious phenomenon in this country. When I interviewed Nick Minchin for the book, he was the Senate leader, worked very closely with Tony Abbott when they first brought down Malcolm Turnbull over the climate policy that they were backing of Kevin Rudd's. I said to him, look, you were science minister at the time of your early part of your ministerial career, in charge of the CSIRO. You know, they were providing you all these reports on climate science. And he said he preferred to do his own deep dive into the science of climate change, and he came up with big support for a guy called Richard Lindzen, a very respectable MIT scientist, but not necessarily a climate scientist, but he happened to be one of the biggest naysayers of climate change and an absolute hero of the climate skeptic groups. And people like not only Nick Minchin, but Gina Reinhart, obviously Barnaby Joyce, a lot of these people in what I call the Carbon Club, they would support these scientists. I think Gina Reinhart put Ian Plimer on her board. Her organisation supported Lord Monckton's tour of Australia. You know, that they fitted the mentality that they thought fitted their interests, and they translated their interests, I think, as the country's interests.
I mean, Tony Abbott famously linked climate change policy to primitive people killing goats to appease volcano gods. But why do religion and climate skepticism seem so linked on the conservative side of politics? Is it a matter of faith or politics or just perception?
This was a very curious one, and I remember talking to David Marr about this at the time when I was writing it, because, as you know, he'd done a lot of work on Cardinal George Pell. And one of the things I was particularly interested in was that there's a conservative skeptic think tank in the UK, one of the few, funnily enough, because they don't get as much traction there as they do here. And John Howard had given a keynote speech there, Tony Abbott had given a keynote speech there, and oddly, one of the other people who had was Cardinal George Pell. And I was quite curious about this because, as you know, many people in the church, and particularly the current Pope, have been quite vocal on wanting to do something about climate change. And I think the way I understood it at the end was it was a fundamental support for conservatism. And there was this amazing scene at one of the annual dinners of the Institute of Public Affairs, the think tank in Melbourne that's done so much to back climate skeptics in this country. And the dinner that night, I think they had George Pell, I think Rupert Murdoch had turned up, they had Gina Reinhardt. It was that they were all there, all thinking the same, I think, all reinforcing their views. And yes, I don't want to kind of caricature people who were at that dinner, because there is a lot of nuance as well, but fundamentally, they still saw it as a left-right thing. And this was at a time, you know, when the IPCC, the International Science Advisory Body, with the CSIRO, every major scientific academy in the world was saying this is a really serious, urgent problem you have to deal with.
Many people, including One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts and Liberal backbencher Craig Kelly, have suggested that the whole climate emergency is a worldwide conspiracy involving every climate scientist in the world, NASA, the Bureau of Meteorology, and possibly some alien lizards. Tell me, did you find any evidence of this conspiracy to bring down the world economy?
I did not, and I think that a lot of the scientists who work in this area are particularly keen that we do find ways where we can run a clean economy that does produce wealth and support for people around the world. I think that the idea that, you know, that there's a conspiracy out there, etc., I think, again, it's sometimes a bit of red meat to throw to the base. I think it's a way of trying to easily avoid having to deal with the enormous problems we have in doing something about climate change.
Okay, so look, miners, coalition donors are one thing, right? But in 2007, Rupert Murdoch said that climate change poses clear catastrophic threats. We may not agree on the extent, but we certainly can't afford the risk of inaction, and announced that News Corporation was carbon neutral in 2011. He's also said that there are no climate deniers at News Limited. But why does News so vociferously dispute climate change through its editorials and commentators? What's in it for them?
Well, I think there's a few things going on here. When Rupert Murdoch made his famous climate statement back in 2011, I think none of us have much doubt now that that was under the influence of his son, James Murdoch, who to this day, James Murdoch and his wife are strong believers in the science of climate change. As we know, there was a battle in the family and James lost. And I think it was incredibly telling earlier this year when James, through his spokesperson, put out a statement saying one of the reasons for his split with the family was their attitude on climate change. At a very base level, I think that it appeals to a whole section of their readers. You see this on steroids, I think, with Fox News in the US. And
Sky News After Dark here.
And Sky News After Dark here. But curiously, despite the Murdoch papers in the UK, they have not had much traction on this issue. And to my reading of them, don't seem to pursue it very much. What Rupert Murdoch and his editors have always said, oh no, we're just, you know, the commentators are allowed to say what they say, but we run things straight. But I think if you ask any politician in Canberra, certainly, let alone in the States, who've championed a particular climate policy or renewable energy policy, they would have another story, which is that they get belted round the head by whether it's the Daily Telegraph or the Australian or the Adelaide Advertiser or the Courier Mail. And I think it's difficult always to unravel how much of that is because it's a Labor versus Conservative, how much of it is about climate change, how much is it about a cultural stand. But at the bottom line, I think that we can rely on the fact that if James Murdoch thinks that the News Corporation media is playing a negative line on action on climate change, it probably is.
So going back to you talking about meeting the chief climate skepticist or skeptic in Washington and about the moral imperative of climate change, I'm reminded of Kevin Rudd saying that it was the greatest moral challenge of our time. Take out the morality. Just looking at the economics, many people might say, I know Rick Morton, who was at the Oz and now is at the Saturday paper, says, you know, my mum's worried about climate change, but she's also worried about paying her electricity bill. So we're often told that, you know, climate, you know, going to renewables will be too expensive. And yet, despite predictions of a whale wipeout by Barnaby Joyce and $100 leg of lamb, electricity prices have doubled over the last 5 or 10 years. So what are the economic risks of adopting a zero emissions economy and energy production? And what are the risks or economic risks of not doing that?
Well, that is the great balance, the great challenge, I think, for all economies. Sir Nicholas Stern said this very well, the leading UK economist who first tried to quantify this problem. And Ross Garnaut, who did the climate change inquiry for Kevin Rudd, said this too. Especially in Australia, we have this wicked problem, which is that so much of originally our cheap energy that helped power our economy, gave us cheap electricity at home, was based on fossil fuels, is still based on fossil fuels. But we, as a developed country, are one of the most vulnerable, if you read any of the science on climate change, through drought, through sea level rise, through intense bushfire seasons. And for all of us who lived through the last one, you just know, you know, breathing that air was just so bad. And, you know, the legacy of that will be with us for a long time. So that's our dilemma. I think we do have to be mindful that we live in an economy where companies will try and exploit the move. The one thing I think Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor are right on is that the energy companies, if they aren't watched well, will price gouge. They will try and exploit the transition to make more money for their shareholders. So there is a real sense that we do have to do this carefully, but that, you know, can't be seen as just one side of the equation. And I think what really is disconcerting, not only for ordinary Australians who accept the science of climate change, but frankly for so many people in business, is that we're only, you know, at the moment from Canberra, they seem to be stressing just one side of the debate. How much will this transition cost? There is no sense of the fact that the rest of the world, many of the countries in the rest of the world are moving way ahead of us on this, and that Australia is in danger of really falling behind. And I think you only have to look at what's happening in Europe at the moment with movement on transport, cars, green steel, or hydrogen as the next fuel, to see how much Australia is falling behind. And I think in this country, we don't really get a sense that anyone has a vision for another way.
Speaking of rising temperatures, I have to say, Marian, I found myself enraged at that inertia, that mendacity, the manipulativeness, the cynicism, the sheer bad faith of so many people in the Carbon Club and in the book. Now, if it was that hard for me to read it, and not because it wasn't always engaging, gripping, a brilliant articulation of the farrago of the wasted opportunities of the last 15 or 20 years, how the hell did you cope writing it?
I must say I did get quite depressed at some stages, and luckily for me I had a very supportive husband who at the moment is off trying to find some skiing in a warming world, but he did try and keep my spirits up. But there were times, not only when I did get quite depressed writing the book, but I felt I'm sure you all know what this is, the kind of Nietzschean recurrence. You know, you feel, the eternal recurrence. You feel like you're writing about, John Howard's 2004 White Energy paper on how great we're going to be with gas and coal, and then, you get up to 2019 and you're writing exactly the same thing again after you've been through this, whirl of policy and political kind of destruction. But I think, that's in the end one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. The politics of this had been so toxic. It's broken 3 prime ministers. It's broken climate scientists, it's broken businessmen, and I can tell you it's broken senior public servants. It's a powerful story, and I felt I really wanted to put it down, and I hope something good can come out of it.
But will we ever see a resolution of these issues? How can we make our way back from all of this wasted time and opportunity?
Well, oddly, people ask me at the end of this, am I an optimist? I am actually an optimist. I'm not a doomist about these issues. There's a few things that really struck me when I was writing this, and one came out of my visit to Washington, where I interviewed a lot of people in both camps. But one of the things that really hit home to me was the attempt to get the climate issue into the courts in America. There's been 2 cases, I think now have fallen over, directed against ExxonMobil, but I have no doubt, and more importantly, I think senior executives in the fossil fuel industry have no doubt that a case will ultimately succeed. And I think this is what keeps the fossil fuel executives awake at night, is that possibility. On the other end of the spectrum, one thing that I've seen, and I know you've seen too, is the extraordinary thing from young people who are basically saying to us, and more to my generation, this won't stand. And why did you fail? And I think one of the saddest emails I got when I finished this book, and the book came out just a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from a senior public servant in Canberra, a terrific guy who's in the book. And he had gone toe-to-toe with John Howard all the way, pushing for the first renewable energy target, pushing for the first time to try and get a price on carbon emissions. And he sent me this email, and he ended it off by saying, I didn't know the forces arrayed against me, but 2, thank you for telling this our sad story. And then he said, forever, a shame on my generation. And that made me really sad, because I thought this guy had bloody worked his butt off, frankly, to try and change things. But he still felt guilty about it.
I mean, it seems crazy. Do you know, this week is a year since the UN Climate Summit, where Scott Morrison declined to attend and got up in front of the UN and said there's no country doing more to mitigate climate change than Australia. And yet, you know, for a lot of us who, you know, use roll-on deodorant, have gotten, you know, energy-saving halogen light bulbs, you know, don't drive, use public transport, you know, sign up to petitions. It seems like your friend who sent you the email, that the forces arrayed against meaningful change are so powerful. How can the 67% of Australians who do want something done about climate change have their voices heard against this very noisy minority? And how can political parties like the ALP and the Greens, or even those within the Liberal Party who want to do something about climate change, sell the message as effectively as those in the Carbon Club have done for the last few years?
Well, I guess, you know, I'm going to duck that one and say, well, I'm a journalist. I try and sort of lay it out, and it's up to others. But one thing I will say is that, you know, I and you come out of an industry that changed so much in our lifetimes that our heads are still spinning. So for anyone who thinks in the fossil fuel industry that life will go on and that change, when it comes, you know, it never comes evenly. We all know this, whatever industry we're in. It never comes smoothly or easily. It comes in big movements. And, you know, when you see people like Mike Cannon-Brookes getting together with Twiggy Forrest to invest in a major solar thermal development in northern Australia, to possibly send, you know, power via undersea cable to Singapore, you think actually things are changing a bit, whether you like it or not. And I think, you know, that momentum for change, once it gets underway, will possibly happen, you know, much more quickly than we think. But having said that, one thing does ring in my ears. When I was writing the last chapters of the book, I had to listen to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres when he gave his opening speech at the Madrid Climate Conference in 2019. And what he said kind of really struck me. He said that this is the decade. This is the decade where we choose the path. And we go down one path of hope or one path of surrender. And I was quite taken aback by that. But actually, if you read through the IPCC reports, if you read the advice, that's actually what people are saying, that this decade is the decade.
I mean, it's interesting you talking about this transition and fossil fuel companies being aware of these changes. You know, BP has just come out and said that it's a path of basically no return, both economically and I guess in terms of, and structurally, that fossil fuels will diminish as a percentage of energy generation. And it's telling, isn't it, that Adani, who have been fighting for so long for the mine in the Galilee Basin, the vast majority of their domestic energy production in India is actually solar.
Well, in fact, they certainly are moving into that, and they're doing a lot of PR around it. I think if you analyse it, it's a lot more promised at the moment than actually delivered, but nevertheless, you're absolutely right. The fascinating thing is that companies like Adani and like BP are having to really get their credentials out there on renewable energy. And, you know, it makes sense because if these companies are going to have a future, both from their shareholder point of view, from their value point of view, they do not want to be left behind. We all know, you know, the famous Kodak moment when film was no longer in everyone's camera who went on holidays. And I think that that is one thing that is changing a lot, what is happening in the industry itself. And I think for me, watching this, as I did with some of the latter developments in the book, you know, there's these huge fights to, for example, in Tony Abbott's time and with Barnaby Joyce to say we are going to defend the last expansion of the last thermal coal mine in this country forever. At the same time, a number of these big companies, you know, whether it's BHP, whether it's Rio Tinto, they will walk away when they're not making money. And right now, thermal coal in price is going down. They're going to walk away and they will not give a backward glance to the workers or the communities that we've had so many of these bitter fights about. And that's one thing I do try and talk about in the book. And the fact that there were people in government, people like Greg Combet, who was Julia Gillard's climate change minister, who understood that what's glibly called a just transition for workers in these industries, but is so important, that those issues are important. What does happen? And do we do this transition in a way that doesn't leave people abandoned?
But when we look at, say, for example, the building of this big gas pipeline, you know, a potentially stranded asset, or even the fact that this very famously free market government, which has always believed that the market will decide, is now intervening to buy Little Power Station, despite AGL not wanting it, pretty much no other power generator wanting it. How can the government justify this investment when the potential returns on renewable energy investment seem to be so much greater?
Well, I think the answer is in the fact of our, you know, I don't know who did the last count on this, but 20 plus energy policies. At the end of it, I think we've got a big mess, and most people don't know really how to price investment in energy in this country anymore, because you know, whether it was Malcolm Turnbull's scheme, whether it was Kevin Rudd's scheme, whether it was Julia Gillard's scheme, and I suspect whether it's going to be Scott Morrison's scheme, without some clear policy that everyone agrees on, it's just not going to stand. And look, call me cynical, but after ploughing through all this, I sometimes wondered over the last few days whether the big gas announcement we've seen, with all the sort of bells and whistles and everything that is accompanied it, is far more about getting one particular project, the Narrabri gas development by Santos, given the green light in New South Wales, than it is really about a big vision for a gas-led recovery. But maybe I'm too cynical after following the twists and turns of this for so long.
And who would blame you? Now, do you have a question for Marion? If you're on Facebook Live, please put your question into the comments. If you've got a question here at the Royal Oak, ask your question and I'll repeat it for you on the microphone so everyone at home can hear the question as well. Now, don't forget, it is a question, not a statement, rumination or meander. We don't have a lot of time, so do keep it brief, and I will be listening for the inflection at the end. Okay? Who's got a question for Marion?
Thank you. I found it fascinating, Marion. I can't wait to read the book, so thank you. But just pushing a bit further, really is a question, on the sort of, the Abbott, Pell kind of nexus, and the, illogicality, the irrationality, really, that they're still supporting a carbon club who, as you say, will walk away from them in the end. I was really interested in the thesis that Anne Mann had about what white men, basically, and she was talking about Morris Newman, and her view seemed to be that he thought that if all of this was true, if we had climate change and we couldn't control the climate and the world, and we couldn't keep extracting profits and getting richer, then the whole game was up. There'd be no purpose to your existence, really, as a powerful white man who could control the earth. And I'm just wondering whether you feel that there's something there or if it's pushing a bit too far.
So I'll just repeat the question for everyone at Facebook. The question was, what's the nexus between Abbott, Pell and conservative white men? Drawing on Anne Mann's question about the Maurice Newman, a very influential kind of advisor
Skeptic
and
too,
a big climate skeptic as well, former chair of the ABC. Maurice Newman said, if we couldn't continue to control the climate, if we couldn't continue to extract minerals, if we couldn't continue to make profits, would this kind of threaten our existence as powerful white men, present company accepted?
Well, I think there's an element of truth in it, to the extent that it's a little bit like that thesis I was talking about before, that there was a feeling that this was a bit of a socialist plot from Europe that would undermine Australia's wealth, and I think there was a sense of that quarry vision in there, and that not only their personal wealth but the wealth of Australia and how they understood Australia was challenged by this. But, you know, one of the things that I do try and break down in the book is that people see a lot of these guys, whether it's Tony Abbott or Ian Plimer, or for that matter Maurice Newman, as kind of slightly mad uncles who kind of proliferate in this debate. They're actually often very close to the centre of decision-making in an odd way. They end up being in these positions. And I think the reason why is that while their views may be extreme, most people in positions of power essentially don't see this as an urgent problem. They're what the skeptics would call lukewarmers, which is they don't deny that the physics of climate change is real, that the climate is changing, but it's happening very slowly and we've got plenty of time. And I have sat across the table from a lot of these people in politics, in journalism, in business, and my view is that that's why there's no urgency. And then the extreme ends of this get a lot of airplay, but that middle ground, that's what really allows the policy to die.
It kind of feels like frogs in a slowly warming tub of water, you know, that, okay, well, we denied it before, but, okay, now we acknowledge it is, but it's not quite as bad, and we've got time, but it might cost a lot, but we've got a question from Small on Facebook Live asking, how are other countries' climate or carbon clubs different to Australia, and how do each of these carbon clubs influence or inform each other?
Well, I think there is quite a lot of overlap, obviously, with the US and us, and there's a hell of a lot about that in the book. One of the things that is interesting in the early days was just, oops, there goes my microphone. It's okay, it's still on live. Yeah, how influential someplace like a company like ExxonMobil was, that the kind of support they gave to climate skepticism really did spill over into Australia and Canada in particular. Interestingly, in Europe, it didn't happen that way. And I think what their companies did was that they purely argued the economic case, and that seemed to work. But in Australia and the US, they really contested the science. Interestingly now, though, in countries like France, obviously, and the UK, we are, in a sense, in a far worse position now with our level of carbon emissions, pollution, especially per head of population, than they are. So, yeah, they didn't have the influence that our carbon club is, but, you know, this is a small country. So, though the power brokers in this country are a much smaller group of people, and they have a hell of a lot more influence.
Any other questions for Marion in the audience?
Yes, the tenor of the argument at the moment that seeming to come across from these commentators is that we can't meet the demands of industry with renewables currently, and we need a stopgap. What's your answer to that?
So just for everyone at Facebook Live, on Facebook Live, the current kind of debate or argument right now is that we can't meet the energy demands of industry with renewables alone. You know, they're unreliable, they're expensive, so we need that stopgap.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I don't think anyone disputes that we still need some gas for a transition period. The big question is how quickly is the transition and how much effort needs to be made to make the transition. One of the things I did understand when I was writing the book, and several people said to me, is that the senior business figures in this country, especially during Howard's period, but certainly later on with Gillard and Rudd, continually underestimated how quickly renewables would develop. And in a sense, this is why we kind of got ourselves into a bit of a mess over the electricity grid, because renewables took off a hell of a lot faster than they predicted. And so the work that needed to go in to stabilise the grid wasn't done until relatively recently, essentially. And there still needs to be a lot of work, and no one disputes this, in stabilising the grid. But the opportunities out there, and if you read any of the kind of recent reports on this by the Australian Energy Market Operator and others, the potential here is great. It really is great. And the fact that Australians themselves have embraced this technology provides a real opportunity. For example, when we do shift to, finally, when someone comes up with a plan for it, when we do shift to electric vehicles en masse in this country, your home or your local community could well become the local grid for, you know, the not only your home but your car. So the technology is moving. You do need a transition, and you absolutely do need what's called firming power. And I think this is one thing that Malcolm Turnbull did force into the debate, quite rightly. But these technologies are well underway, and I think the frustrating thing for even companies like AGL over the battle over the closing down the Liddell power station is that's precisely some of the technology that AGL is trying to work on, is the stuff on the firming power, on battery power. And I guess many of you will remember the brouhaha over the blackouts in Adelaide a few years ago, and when ultimately the then Premier Jay Weatherill commissioned Elon Musk to do the battery there to stabilise the grid at the South Australian end, people like Scott Morrison said, oh, you know, big battery, big banana, you know, basically dissed it completely. Anyway, that battery has been incredibly successful in helping to stabilise the electricity supply in South Australia. So yes, it's working. Yes, there still needs to be a lot more work. And yes, there is gas that's needed for the transition period, but most people are saying that transition period again is this period of the decade.
Any other questions for Marion?
Thanks, Sunil. Thanks, Marion. Really fascinating discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm just wondering if you've got any comment on the failure of, has there been a failure in our science communication, in our media? Why is it that there are a cohort of politicians in power in Australia who don't see the existential threat to our globe that climate change presents?
So just to ask for everyone at Facebook, why has there been such a failure by science communicators, by the media, to kind of push forward the existential threat of climate change in a way that everybody can understand outside of self-interest? And why are there so many politicians in power who can't see that existential threat?
I think this was certainly one of the saddest parts of the book I had to write, is on what happened to the science in Australia. And it's partly told in 3 chapters that I kind of pepper through the book on the Great Barrier Reef. And what you see is we have a lot of really good scientists in this country, and we had a lot of really good climate scientists. We still do at CSIRO, but there were a lot that were shed in the Abbott period. They beat themselves up about the failure to communicate. And one of the things I think I tried to do in the book is to explain why they were so attacked by the climate skeptics. Because I don't think it was just their failure of communication. There was a really coherent strategy to undermine them. But the difficult part, I think, for Australia, it's left a legacy where the science is contested, and for that matter, many scientists have been so under attack in this process that they do find it difficult to communicate with politicians and with the public. But you know, the weird thing is, I remember one of the reef scientists saying to me that when politicians would come up and visit the reef, and he'd take them snorkeling and he'd show them what was going on with bleaching and what was going on with, you know, the disappearance of various coral species, and that they'd get it, but then they'd go back to Canberra and, you know, talk to the Minerals Council or whatever, and the policy didn't change. But I do think that restoring the respect of the scientists, especially in CSIRO, the Bureau of Meteorology, in our universities, I do think that's a critical thing for a country, but particularly for this country, when you see the toxicity of the debate that went around these scientists.
Look, we've run out of time, so we're going to wind it up here. Thank you so much for all your wonderful questions, and thank you, Marion, for such an enlightening conversation. It's such a breath of fresh air after all this climate change gaslighting, isn't it?
And Sunil, thank you so much for your very fantastic conduct of this interview. And to everyone listening on Facebook, and to all you terrific people who turned up, so I could see some real faces out there as well. It was lovely to be here.
The Carbon Club is published by Allen & Unwin, and Marion is available for a chat when she signs your copy here in the Royal Oak, which you can also buy here tonight, in store at Roaring Stories, or online in the order form just on the Facebook Live page. If you're in Balmain or surrounding suburbs, postage is free. And while you're there, why don't you sign up to the Roaring Stories newsletter on the Roaring Stories website at roaringstories.com.au, where you can get lots of fantastic offers, sales news, interviews with your favourite authors, including some very special Roaring Stories curated Spotify playlists, events, and more. I'm Sunil Badami. It's been great having this wonderful chat with you, Marion, and with you, and I look forward to seeing you, if not at our next Roaring Stories online author event, then in store. Thanks very much.